Just briefly, I think it's a good question. It's funny, I wrote down a note as Dr. Dimbo was speaking about feel good, because as a legislator, as a former legislator, and we look for numbers. We want to know, how are the percentage of students, test scores are going to go up. And so to convince us that something that feels good translates into actual progress is difficult for legislators, which means it's difficult for funding. I think one of the things that those of us and those of you who are in the education field, it's hard for us to grapple is that legislators aren't educators. Most are like me. They're usually lawyers or from some other place, and their interaction with our public education system, if they interact at all, is through their children. So getting them to understand that this stuff that cultural competence, in the long run, will keep children in school. That was the basis of our study, is that not so much whether their test scores went up, but whether they were active in their class, whether in 3 years their attendance rate went up, and whether in 4 years or when they graduated, whether their graduation rates went up. So not so much whether their test scores, but over a long period of time. And most legislators and most politicians don't deal in long term. They deal in election cycles. And so I think one of the big things that we tried to do at CTI and teamed up with NEA to do was a 2-year study on the effectiveness of minority teaching on minority teachers on minority kids, which Dr. Geneva Gay did the study for us, which has very little data out there. But what we wanted to do was be able to go back to state legislators and federal people and say, here's some information, here's some data, since you want data. But the real key is look at our systems over the long term of teachers who get it right. And I think that's what we have to start doing, is getting, and I would suggest once again you start at the state level, getting them to see programs that are actually effective and studying them over the long term.
Research is in a very bad place. We've had an administration that that got rid of ERIC and calls for scientifically based research, and by their definition of what is science, it locked out all the groups of children that we're advocating for, because they didn't disaggregate their data, so they came up with instructional strategies that were good, but we didn't know good for who, and they were implemented, and we could, and they don't work. So that's a problem. The other problem is, as bad as the research is for Latino students and Native American students, it's worse for African American students. I don't know why African American advocacy groups don't do a better job at getting research, particularly with African American populations. Doesn't seem to be enough research in that area, and not all children are the same. They're just not all the same. I mean, we all have to recognize our commonality, our humanity, and the great differences we have from each other, as well as our cultural differences. So I would cry for specifically African American student research.
Could I make a quick response to Carrie's comment or question? One of the things, Carrie, I wanted to address real quickly is your question about how it looks to have curriculum or culture in the classroom. One of the things that we have to start thinking about in education, for so long, we've been thinking about education as in a four-wall classroom. We have to start thinking outside the box, because education doesn't start in the classroom. Education is all over the place. And what we're talking about, the mores of communities and how we learn, is, think about yourself, is that we learn from our own personal experiences at home. And where do we get that information from? From our home environment, from our family, community members, and so forth, where we grew up. So all we do is take that knowledge, bring it into the classroom, and use it in order to learn something in school. For example, in a Navajo culture, for example, when you talk about doing a science project, on objects in the sky, for example, you're talking about the Orion. The Greek Orion has a story, so you teach it to your students. Well, the same thing happens in Navajo culture. You have the Navajo Orion. He has his story, protector of his people. But you see, you bring those two together in the classroom, the concepts are the same. but you have two different interpretations. So then that makes that child becomes twice as strong and twice as knowledgeable. Thank you.